I
We're
didn't
good to
get the
go.
warning, but okay, good to go. Thank you, Haley. And then maybe before we jump right into the agenda, Haley, if you could just run down these quick reminders of the promises and pitfalls of community conversations in this virtual space. Thank you.
Yeah, so just for notice for today's meeting, I'm going to be on tech support. So if you have any issues, either on Zoom or we're using the Menti polling again. So throughout the meeting, if you have any tech issues, feel free to send me a message and let me know. I can help sort it out for you. But just some reminders here on the screen. Try to keep your background noise down by muting unless you're actively speaking. There's lots of buttons on Zoom. We want your input at all times. So feel free to use those buttons to let us know that you want to say something. You can raise your hand. You can drop it in the chat. If you have extra comments, feel free to put those in the chat as well. And just reminder that tech is not always perfect, so we appreciate your patience in advance.
On that first one, though, I just wanted to point out that the second main activity is really open discussion, and we don't want to stifle or delay or create any kind of hesitancies. So we'll understand if people want to take themselves off mute to make sure that they can just chime in, but the main point is to be respectful. We know with audio and tech delays, sometimes it sounds like we're talking over each other, but certainly don't want anyone to think that's what the intention is. So we'll try to moderate and make sure that we sort of recall on people throughout the process if they're having difficulties getting in. So with that, just a reminder per posted agenda and all the information that went out, and acknowledge and recognize past challenges. Sometimes the meeting information maybe got lost in email, so took that to heart and made sure to send out a calendar invite for this meeting, and it's already borne results, and we have better attendance than the previous meeting, so good practice moving forward, and we'll keep that up. But first off, just again, a welcome to you all. Happy New Year. As David and Kavika alluded to, I'm glad to still be working with you all on this project, but I'd like to take this moment to reintroduce myself as the City Chief Resilience Officer and the Executive Director for the Office of Climate Change, Sustainability, and Resiliency, stepping up from my previous role as Coastal and Water Program Manager. Still project managing for this project in particular, but don't want to lose the sight that we have advertised and opened an announcement for that former position, and application materials are due Friday of this week. Desperately trying to and keep the personnel support needed. Similarly, working to fill some other roles in the office. But most importantly about this advisory group, we have a roster update. And I'd like to, though he's not on the call today, thank Stuart Chong from Hawaiian Electric for his participation and service to date, but also now introduce Kahikina Burgess, also with Hawaiian Electric, who's filling in for continuity from the utilities perspective. Kahikina, I'd like you to introduce yourself. What we've done in the past is one, just sort of name, role, position, and then why you're interested or what you hope to get out of in supporting the advisory hui.
Sure, thanks. Hi everyone, I'm Kahikina. I work for Hawaiian Electric. I'm a senior reliability and resilience strategist. At Hawaiian Electric, we have infrastructure in different places all over the islands, obviously, and so yeah, interested in providing input and learning from you all from that perspective. So glad to be here.
Great, thank you. Didn't mean to put you on the spot after a night of heavy winds and some potential reliability issues, but we know that the utilities out there working hard and diligently to help people and community all across the island. So thanks for that. We're glad to have you and glad to have the continued participation from Hawaiian Electric. So moving right along, you should have all received notice in December about the notes that were posted from the November the 9th meeting, I believe it was. Have not yet received any comments or questions from those notes. So barring any staunch objections, I'd like to move that we simply accept the meeting notes from meeting number 2. Just looking for general consensus. Again, we don't have a formal voting process in this advisory board. At least get Dan Donnell's thumbs up. Yeah, and some virtual and real thumbs up. I'll take all the validation I can get. Okay, great. Thank you, everyone. Dave, was that a question or a high five? Okay, got it. Great. Thanks, everybody. Kathy, be careful. Okay. Very quickly, we want to just recap where we came from following November. 2 months since we last met. We want to fill you in on what the project team, the city agencies have been doing based on the input provided by community, as well as you all as the advisory group, and then really make sure we provide real adequate time for agenda items 4 and 5. So I'm going to move right into the project updates. As a reminder, we have these different phases and topics, as well as key questions that we're trying to ask along the way. Hopefully you recall in round 1, we were really keying in on climate change and local consequences of action and inaction, gauging people's perceptions and gut reactions to climate hazard impacts. That was from the intro survey that everyone participated on and that we facilitated in the first meeting. And then additionally, we were trying to get some initial thoughts towards guiding principles or values for climate change adaptation. And that was all in round 1. And then still within phase 1, in meetings number 2, we did a deeper dive into understanding climate hazards and exposures. We did that MAP activity with you all to help us think through possible adaptation action areas. We looked at evaluation criteria to think about issues to the people in place, the environment of that place, as well as the economy of the island as a whole. And that sort of straddled phases 1 and phase 2 in the work that we've done since then, that we're getting now into the specifics of adaptation actions. So since last we met, the departments further worked on all of the information that you provided, along with your thoughts and considerations around the specific hazards. Remember those 5 hazards, as well as those 3 consequence categories of people, place, and the economy. We also, with the consultant team, finalized the climate risk assessment, as well as prepared these community climate briefs, which are intended to support the planning department and community all across the island to better understand the localized consequences. So very quickly, to recap, here was that very challenging but hopefully fun interactive activity we did via Zoom with Annotate. And on balance, there were 4 clear above and beyond geographic areas that received significant response, whether it was departments, the community meetings, or you all as the advisory group, using those evaluation criteria that we discussed. And those areas were Kaka'ako through Waikiki, Kualoa through Kahuku, Makaha, the west side through Nanakuli, and then Mopunapuna into Iwalei area. And there was a little bit of a bigger gap, but we wanted to make sure that we also looked at an area that wasn't just coastal and also had a lot of interest. So on balance, the next top response getter was really the Kapolei, Makakilo, Ewa area, generalized, keying in on an important growth area for the island, issues around water stress, as well as increasing temperatures, and an important growing economic sector out there. So it's these 5 areas that will be further engaging community members next week in the round 3 meetings, as well as with departments in some working sessions coming up later in February. And then also we finalized the climate risk assessment. You may recall in meeting number 2 with you all, we had the lead consultant, Susan Assam from ICF, discussing the process and the methodology to work through the risk assessment, ultimately towards the adaptation action areas. And what you see here are some of the, a generalized graphic showing, again, that process, as well as the ultimate rating scale for those 5 climate hazards that we were looking at. Again, they included both shocks and stresses where you know, a rain bomb or a hurricane is really an event that has significant consequence. But things like sea level rise, coastal erosion, increase in temperatures, as well as issues around rainfall are stresses that can manifest in a certain shock. And based on the preponderance of physical and projected evidence, as well as additional discussions with departments, the contributions from you all in the first two meetings, what we have shown here is really this 2050 rating score that combine the risk, right? This is our rate risk for these hazards. And what we really wanted to stress here is that the science is dead clear around sea level rise and increasing temperatures. That's just really direct correlation with increasing greenhouse gas pollution for the last 150 years, accelerating in the last 60 plus years. And everything that people projected in the 1950s regarding temperature has already come to pass in the early 2000s here. So again, the relationship and certainty around heat and sea level rise is quite good. And that is represented sort of in that likelihood on the y-axis. And it's on the x-axis where we evaluated consequence based on studies, reports, discussions, information that you all provided. And, you know, one thing that maybe might catch people off guard is like, why would hurricane be perhaps lower in this ranking when in our hazard mitigation plan, it ranks as the primo #1 thing. And again, it's based on this likelihood and consequence into the future where we have more certainty about sea level rise and temperature really reaching these thresholds or tipping points, whereas a hurricane is still an extremely consequential event, but the likelihood relative to those other stresses and shocks is not as high. And again, these are the main climate hazards that we are investigating throughout the project. And then lastly, we wanted to provide additional support to the community planning process. So if we have all of this information at the island-wide scale, we've done the next step to create these community climate briefs, which we're finalizing, and we will post online and ultimately provide as resources and support to the planning department, to community members, neighborhood boards, anyone that's interested in getting a little bit more detail on the hazards and the consequences for those areas. And those areas are at the consistent with the development and the sustainable communities plans, because that's one of the primary ways that we think about managing community and environmental change through time. So up next, you know, we have this meeting with you today to talk about both adaptation action proposals and development of those ideas, think more about the concepts of climate change and social equity. We have the next round of community meetings next week on Wednesday, Friday, and Saturday. And the input and your reactions today will help us finalize the preparation and the activities for next week. The city departments are evaluating and developing and reviewing a whole suite or laundry list of potential actions in response to the concerns that they shared with us in the early phases. And then we will have a city department, really a series of working sessions later in February, hopefully the week of the 22nd. And then just letting you all know that we continue ongoing intergovernmental coordination, working up and down with the state, as well as now getting better connected with potential federal opportunities to address our challenges. We continue the city briefings and trainings that we've done around climate change. And we're also setting up and preparing for executing on some new city policies related to this project, as well as climate change adaptation generally, and helping to define really this concept of one water, which came into law at the tail end of last year. And I have a question here, or a comment from Chip regarding the consequences. Thank you for that thought. We'll bring it back. We did have a discussion with others within the Climate Change Commission to get their thoughts and evidence. we'll bring that back to the consultants. And Kahikina, curious about this as well regarding Chip's comment, again, acknowledging that really everything that we've been told to date regarding a hurricane seems it's probably maybe even off the charts on the consequence scale. So we'll bring that back to the team and let folks know how it's being received, and see what we can do to address that. Also, it looks like Kathy Camp potentially has her hand up, so happy to field a question if that's correct. If not, any other questions regarding the project updates from the advisory committee first? Hearing and seeing none. Any questions on this agenda item from members of the public? And again, Haley, if you're able to help me review the participant list, I don't have access to that right now.
Sorry, Matthew, this is Dave Arakawa. In your break, while you're drinking, I just want to chime in. I think for the adoption actions, you know, this group, your office has done a pretty good job at trying to gather a broad cross section, but I couldn't help but notice, I don't know if the hotels in Waikiki are represented that much on this group, and like the areas that would be affected, like Ala Moana Shopping Center would be affected by climate change, and Kaka'ako, right? I think we have a pretty good coverage on the Leeward Coast and on the you know, Windward or North Shore and other areas, but just wondering about those areas. I don't know about Hawaii Kai, how much Hawaii Kai would be impacted, or you know, that area, East Honolulu, would be impacted. But for the adoption actions, I think they'd do well, and hopefully they'll chime in the public meetings we have at the end of this month. But perhaps whoever, I don't know if it's you or somebody else, decides who's on this advisory hui, but it'd be well to have those types of people on board. I don't know if Hawaii Gas, is Hawaii Gas on board also? Not yet.
Hey,
thanks,
David. Yeah,
okay,
I'm here.
Okay. So yeah, just so that we have the
Julie's
utilities.
participating as a member of the public, and Dave, I know you raised that at the first meeting, and we addressed it in the meeting minutes at the second meeting, at which you were unfortunately not able to participate. Invitations did go out farther than just who's participating here. As you alluded to, right, there's the benefit of being on the advisory group, but also the importance of participating in any and all of the public participation opportunities. We've continued to reach out to people, but that's not to say that more can't be done. So especially now coming into this new year and looking at where we are in the project phase, it's pertinent and important that we continue to do the one-on-one reach out. Obviously, doing one-on-one communication is both time intensive and challenging to coordinate. So we'll strive for both, and we support, again, what the advisory board, one of the original requests was to help us identify who we can and should be communicating with, even if they are not direct participants on the advisory hui. So we'll take your recommendations forward. And sort of as an aside, and as it relates to my new position, I'll be doing individual reach outs on activities and projects of the office, and this project is of real critical importance to make sure that people are aware of and participating. And the best way to be aware of is to sign up for our newsletter so you get all the information right from the horse's mouth.
Got it. Thank you very much, Matthew. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Any other questions from the advisory members on the project updates, this particular agenda item? If not, any questions from community members regarding project updates, this agenda item? Great. So again, you know, as we move on into this next agenda item, the intention is to also use you all as resources as sometimes test on the ideas to get your feedback and reactions to refine the kinds of things that we then ask in the community settings or ask in any sector one-on-one discussions or other engagement and education forums. So what we have for us today is activity and discussion on recommendations for adaptation actions. And as you all remember, we had those 5 main hazards of concern. We've clumped them a little bit into these 3 categories of sea level rise, sea level wise, getting flood ready, and doing everything that we can to beat the heat. So what we're going to do right now is the activity, and then within the activity, there's breakpoints for entering additional information as well as open discussion, and we have some note takers to support us with this. But hopefully you all remember the fun of using Menti, because we're going to do that at this point. So I'm going to ask Haley to drop into the chat the direct link, and this should help you more readily get to it. So there's 2 ways: either click on the chat link or open a browser on your own and enter in the code 6243834. And as everyone's getting into the system, again, best practice as we move forward is to better understand who we are and who we are not connecting with. So we have the same standard get to know you demographic questions that you all contributed to in the first meeting. And thank you for your patience as we go through that again. It's important for us to get this at each stage and each engagement activity. And these first several demographic questions, all the results are hidden. All the questions are required, but as in the past, there is an option to select prefer not to respond. And then we'll quickly get through these and then get to the specific activity. Looks like we have about half participating so far. And again, let Haley know if you're having any challenges or difficulties getting into the Menti activity. Give it a couple more seconds, make sure folks are comfortable. Okay, I think I'm going to move us right along. You folks are getting the picture. Oh, and you're already progressing. So Haley just reminded me that there's always 2 options when you're doing Menti polling, either presenter pace or audience pace. And it looks like it might be on audience pace. So that's always a good reminder as you're getting ready for your public meetings to check that. Honestly, I thought I had, and maybe I misinterpreted what was grayed out and what was not grayed out. So as you all are all progressing, I think I'll just move us to the final. Oh man! All right, gang. We have a lot of great active participation. I'm going to pause here at the final demographic question, as some folks have done their homework and accelerated into the actual activity questions. So I'm going to give this a couple more seconds. It looks like maybe 30 was our threshold. Once we get here, we'll jump into the action areas and then discuss what's being asked of you all. Okay, it looks like, yeah. Go ahead, David.
I think with respect to the questions, I'll wait. Maybe I should wait until I'll let you go.
Yeah, appreciate that. Okay, so what we see here obviously is a lot of people have gotten into the activity. And again, we're going to go through these 3 clumps which represent the 5 main hazards that we're looking at. And even within these categories, we tried to put similar concepts together so that you can clump and see them. And these are some of the kinds of ideas and thoughts that came out of the intro survey from meeting 1 that you all participated in and has lived online for several months at this time. And we are asking generally, because there's not a lot of detail in any of them, initial gut reactions to strongly oppose, to strongly support. But what we're also hoping to get from you all today is additional thoughts to refine any of these as we then get into the community meetings and ultimately promote and post a new survey online to use with our subsequent discussions with stakeholders, community members, et cetera. So as you can see, these are ideas that have come out of either past plans, the hazard mitigation plan, department discussions, community discussions, trying to think of ways to address extreme heat, wildfire, and drought. And then maybe before I go on to the next graphic here, it sounds like you had a question.
Oh, yeah, I had a question on the first thing. And that is maybe in future questions or for questions you're talking about refining for future questions, maybe to the public, there's a difference between require or mandate and incentivize, right? So if you break those up, that might be easier because yes, we support it 1000%, but maybe not if you mandate it, if you incentivize it, or if you make it an option, right? And then perhaps there needs to be an explanation that if you mandate it, it increases the costs of the unit, the residential unit or the construction thing like that, it's a cost benefit kind of a thing. But I think there's a huge difference between mandating something and incentivizing something, and the state recognizes that because as soon as solar roofs became a mandate, they took away the incentives, right? Because it's a mandate, you don't have to incentivize it, right? So
yeah, so it sounds like the 2 points that I hear from you, David, are obviously to make sure that when you're asking to get opposition to support on the spectrum, make sure it is a singular question so people understand. So we're not confusing or having 2 things that really could be separated out into 2 questions, right? It's either one or the other. But then also making sure that even in something as simplistic as this, to acknowledge as best and clear as possible potential consequences of doing a thing. Is that correct? Okay.
Sorry, I couldn't unmute. Yes, that's correct.
Yep.
Yes. Sorry.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, we'll take a look at all of these, not just this section, but all of the sections to make sure that a question is asking one thing, because even when you get a response on a multi-tiered question, you don't know what any particular respondent is actually addressing or answering. And for me, it's obviously we can see responses. That's not the main point of today's activity. It's actually that back and forth that was just had between David and myself to get a better sense from you all, good, bad, or otherwise, the kinds of propositions and the way things are being framed.
Matt, it's Dan Donnell. And
hey, Dan.
On the trees question in that vein, I think the third one down, it's not on the screen right now, but it was establish new programs or something for tree planting. And I'm not sure if new is the right thing, it's more.
Establish any?
Well, yeah, because there's existing programs and, so it seems to me the better phrasing is support tree planting programs or something like that. So it kind of acknowledges there's existing ones, that probably some coming down the pike, because it's rather narrow on just new ones.
Yeah. No, I appreciate that. And to David's point about specificity and clarity, we're trying to avoid language that, ultimately we want to get to as much specificity as possible so that these are like fully fledged things. There's a clear path for pursuing investments or pursuing policies or pursuing programs and projects, because we know oftentimes at the community plan level, there's big, broad policy statements that talk about support this, encourage that. And what we're trying to move on from, and the intention of this project and the adaptation strategy, is to support departments to better know risks to their own things, but also find clear, agreed upon measures to address the reality of the climate change issues community-wide. So just saying support really wouldn't satisfy, me that much, and probably doesn't bring a lot of clarity to the discussion. So, especially as we move on from here, get into the next round of community meetings and advisory HUI meetings, that's what we're really trying to refine. Because it's got to be, as Kathy alluded to in the first meeting, like we can't just have more of these things. They've got to be really actionable and implementable. Otherwise, they're not necessarily going to be effective. So appreciate that, Dan.
I'm sorry, Matthew, on the extreme heat, wildfire, and drought, the first question, I'm not sure if you know, but the State Building Code Council last month just rejected a requirement and mandate for all houses in the state of Hawaii to have insulation, air conditioning, and heater insulation like on the mainland for homes that don't have, open air homes. So like on the neighbor islands, open air homes, no air condition, just open the windows. So
yep.
There was a proposal by the Building Code Council to require thermal energy insulation on all houses, and the Big Island strenuously objected because it would increase the cost of a house. Even if you don't have air conditioning, you would have to put in insulation to address air conditioning between all of your walls and above your ceiling. And so the Building Code Council rejected that. There was one person, the Big Island building official, rejected that. So I'm not sure if this is what is being asked, but I think perhaps we need to think about how to describe it to people, so that describe it to the local residents to say, some of this is for mainland, is for the mainland, and it could be interpreted, somebody could take it and say, okay, you voted strongly agree on this, so we're going to impose mainland standards on Hawaii, where we use trade winds and things like that. We're going to force you to put air conditioning and heater insulation in all of your homes, no matter where it is, right? So I'm not sure if this question would be used to support something like that, but we can talk story later offline.
Great question. No, I'm familiar with the State Building Code Council. We know our energy program manager, and you all were on that meeting. Obviously, what's done at the state is really important to help set the standards and expectations. Local amendments are always up for debate and discussion, so we wouldn't want to close the door if there's something that people are interested in investigating, and that's really what we're trying to do. But acknowledge, as you alluded to in the previous question, of being upfront of potential consequences. But again, what we're really trying to get at is being honest about the challenges, and if it's always no can, then we got to find other ways to figure out ways to support communities to thrive into the future when it's multiple days of 105 heat index across community. So we'll look towards the leadership and interest and ideas and vision about how to continue to have prosperous communities into the future. So good questions, David. Okay, and we'll as a team after this meeting, we'll come back to all the great additional inputs you folks are providing here, and then really revisit and reconsider how to refine the questions before we post any kind of survey or polling information online. I'm trying to check, before we move on, just reviewing the chat, and also feel free, folks, if you're interested, to unmute yourself. We got Brent acknowledging trees in and of itself are not just the thing. You know, how do we highlight benefits and opportunities for native plants? So, you know, Brent, especially if you have recommendations on how to refine a question, that would be great. Or when we get into the next series of meetings to identify specifics and details for program and project implementation, that's great as well. Kimiona seconds. Also, folks, if you do get, I would, you know, big shout out to Kimiona. He was the front cover of HMSA's monthly publication, showing all the great community volunteer work and the really active Waimanalo community out there. Body by Aina is what he was quoted as. Okay, sorry to put you on the spot there, Kimiona. From Kathy, yeah, the trade-offs, right? And this is the real and true discussion that we'll need to further play out in this, because the reality is change is coming to us, and unless we're proactively addressing it, we're going to be in a difficult position moving forward. So how do we find ways to support everyone in the transformation and not just make it cost prohibitive and cost burdened? Dana, did you want to ask your specific question about resilience hubs?
Hi, Matt. I think I just wasn't clear when I read the question. I didn't want to make assumptions about the statement and what that means. So I was just looking for, can you guys better define for me by what types of resource distribution or services a resilience hub might enable or create?
Yeah, I think the most superficial thought in that statement is just the reality of like being a place that receives and then distributes support, whether it's food, medicine, water, or serves, or can be set up to serve that function. But there's obviously a lot of other resources and services to think about, and that's what would have to be further defined as the actions get fleshed out.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. And Dottie, I have your comment here regarding food trees, loud and clear. Checking on the advisory members first. Steph, another upvote for the native, yeah. Okay, reviewing Julie's comments regarding trade-offs, people, you know, willingness to pay, all of these kinds of discussions, consequences of regulation, cost-benefit analysis. Yep. Yeah, thank you for those inputs. And again, they shouldn't be left to future discussions. Not every project idea would likely be able to get vetted so thoroughly in the development of an adaptation strategy, but it's really about providing a suite of possibilities for departments, leadership, city council, the administration to think about ways to address the challenges that we're confronted with. Okay. Moving along, the next series look at sea level rise and coastal erosion. Folks are getting up here. Also to, you know, just quickly reviewing, it looks like there's a lot of support for a lot of things. So that's not to say that every idea would move forward. We want to make sure, especially, you know, I alluded to Kathy's comments from the first meeting, is like making sure this is as prioritized as possible to really set the expectations for near-term action. And a reminder for everyone on the call here, this is kind of like adaptation planning 1.0, and the intention all along has been to make sure that the subsequent update of the hazard mitigation plan integrates all of this much more intentionally and thoroughly, because we know that plan will be updated because we're required to by FEMA to be eligible for federal funds. So this is really intended to be a real short-term interim to help set up the direction moving forward around these climate hazards, and then to really just support the community plans and the hazard mitigation plan. Yeah, and really good comments in the chat continuing to come through on the benefits, trade-offs, discussions, costs to do something, costs to not do something, and we'll make sure that that continues to be an integral discussion point throughout this project, and then all towards the final product and the decision-making alignment support.
Matt, this is Kathy. One of the things
Hi, Kathy.
I think about in looking at these questions and these answers and what do you support and oppose, they're all great. And as you can see, just by our grouping, everything is getting really high marks. Well, mostly everything. I mean, the things that make sense, right? But there's no, I think somehow, as I talk about priority, you know, that's the big thing is, you know, everyone can throw all these wonderful things to do and here's the options, pick one that works. I think it'd be great to have some sort of bucketing of priority, like here are the top, here's the medium, and here's the lower part. So we can then focus on the top and then start to ask things about the trade-offs within those. Are you willing to, as a community member, are you willing to partner to help with this initiative and collaborate? Or are you willing to pay more taxes in order to be able to have these things done? Or are you able to, are you willing to pay more for your house? Because, because they will, many of these initiatives could impact costs in some way or another. And the other would then be a prioritization of this initiative. Is this more important than, I don't know, let's say saving jobs at the city and county, to some of the other extreme alternatives that are the unintended consequences of what happens with this. And I think it's really important that we consider all these factors and also look through the alternatives, because if we don't, someone else is going to be doing it. And then it's a reaction kind of discussion versus a thought out one.
So maybe there's even, like a subsequent additional step that needs to happen after this to then, go through a really more of a voting and prioritization
and
process.
A trade-off. Yeah, exactly.
Trade-off discussion. Yeah.
And
so everyone
Matt,
heard it from Kathy. Even though I advertised 5 meetings, we now are going to have 6 meetings so that we can have the additional. No, and that's true. Like, it's important to learn throughout the process. There's challenges on having these difficult discussions. A lot of people maybe haven't necessarily thought about these issues before. So in the engagement, always trying to find sort of the simplest way forward, but don't want to lose sight of the need to have the deeper discussions when they're appropriate and when there's a group that's willing to do it. Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, I think I concur with Kathy's comments. And I think what I would add to that, some of the strategies cost a lot more money than others. And some general idea of the dollar amounts involved are probably important too. Some of these things, a lot of these things are actually, we're talking billions of dollars. If you're going to, require buildings to be moved back from the shore because those buildings will be gone or their first 2 floors will be gone in 20 to 30 years, those sorts of things. So some concept, I guess, of what the scope of cost is might be valuable as well.
Yeah, that's great, Mike. And it certainly, at least in my head, in working through all this, begs the question of like, yeah, we know some things are likely to cost money. We know we already spend a lot of money on things today, but we also know if we don't do things, we're going to have consequences and real financial and economic impact. So how do we understand sort of in the totality of the discussion, the costs of no action? And I imagine most people expect government not to just allow bad things to happen. So we have to find the way forward to protect prosperity and economic opportunity into the future. So again, that's really why we are relying on groups like this, as well as continued discussions with anyone that hasn't yet had an opportunity to participate in community meetings, because I mean, honestly, like the no action alternative is not an option for a lot of this stuff. So that's just the hard, honest truth. it doesn't mean we immediately know what needs to be done one way or the other, or what's even palatable or cost efficient.
Yep.
Well,
If I can add to that too, I agree with what Catherine was saying, and I think putting a realistic, I mean, you need to go from a realistic standpoint, you know, and of course I'm a chamber of commerce. I look at the business aspects, and you know, you have a range, you know, from the small guys up to the corporations. But what, in terms of prioritization to meet these sustainability goals, what do they cost and what's realistic for these different groups? Because if you go to the community and you ask them their opinion, but there's no price tags and no dollar amounts or no scale to that, then you're not going to get that honest feedback that you're looking for either. It's going to be very broad span. So that's the other side to look at too, because at the end of the day, when you go back and there's something that can't be met by the community, and those prices are elevated, then what do? You know, you're at a standstill. So I just wanted to add that I think that that's a good perspective, because I know the business community is very strongly feels about meeting these goals as well, but it's that balancing act of what can be done in the middle.
Yeah, thanks, Kieran. Because even like if we were to look at the responses so far, everyone is 4 and above except for one question so far. So someone might assume like, oh, do all these things except the one that scored real low, but we know that's not necessarily enough, or nor does it provide the explicit path forward and the costs. I mean, but also we need to acknowledge that some may say costs, some may say investments, and sometimes investments can bear returns on the far end. And if that's investing now so that people can actually walk outside, that's a cost savings because people aren't heat stressed or heat stricken in the future. They're able to still work in outdoor activities and engage in sports or engage in agriculture, or, you know, tourists are still willing to come here. So, you know, there is a bigger discussion, and I'm not the best one to navigate that, and that's why we really benefit and rely upon your all's understanding on really like a bigger discussion around cost benefits, investments, returns, and risks.
Matt, can I just kind of chime in
Hi,
something
Shar.
else too? Hi, aloha everyone. I agree that, you know, we should take costs into consideration. In general, what I find, especially with, you know, just being part of the neighborhood board discussions, and I'm sure others have noticed this too, when community comes forward and gives their mana'o on things, they don't necessarily come from a cost perspective, right? They're looking at what is best for their community. There's no price tag at the moment attached to that. So when we talk about these things, I'm very much for exploring the costs. We have to be realistic about that. But when we do that, it's also potentially coming up with possibilities on how do we take the time frame we're looking at some of these things to build up or develop the resources to cover some of these. So the low-hanging fruits might be those that we can do collectively with less output of financial resources, but what we are putting in is our sweat and community labor, which many community organizations already do, right? So we have low-hanging fruits, but at the meet, you know, while we're having these discussions, so it's not only about attaching a price tag to all of these, but giving community an avenue to also be part of how do we develop those resources, whether they're financial, whether it is everybody helping to start seeded plants and trees for a reforestation effort, no matter where it is, right? That kind of things I'd like us to collectively think about as well. So mahalo.
Yeah, thanks for that, Shar. Because if the early discussions always point to no can, then we're never going to think on the opportunities, right? I think someone even mentioned previously, you know, identifying partnerships, right? First you get the idea, then you start to think about what the partnerships are. But if we stopped at this is going to be too much, we wouldn't have thought through a way forward. So we don't want to lose sight of that. And Hunter has a hand raised as well.
I've dropped a few things in the chat and just wanted to comment on some of them. So Sierra Club has adopted someone named Janice Berkland's negative resource transfers assessment as part of our process for determining whether or not we take on a particular project. And I'll try and track down some more of the links on it, but she's a planner who's thought a lot about sustainable development as well as community integration. And so I would offer that as maybe some platform to start thinking through what the facets are of these various interventions that we want to compile are. And then also it added in the chat some pieces about conjoint analysis, which is generally reserved or generally utilized for a lot of marketing programming. But obviously in a rating scale, it's hard to be able to say, is this a 5 or a 4 or a 2 in comparison? So usually conjoint analysis would have two different pieces that you'd be comparing against one another, and the different pairings would change over the series of questions to help tease out what the actual levels are of rating between multiple different choices on a given issue. So I'll be happy to share more on those, and we'll try and track down some of that positive development and negative resource transfer information.
Yeah, Hunter, both of those are well appreciated. I mean, the outputs from community engagement are only as good as how they're structured. So we want to make sure that we're getting to the most specific, most detailed kind of inputs as possible. So, you know, we'll make sure to take a look at that and try as best as we can in the time now to make sure that it's best representative, but also most useful for both us as the project team, but also future users of any of the outputs. And I stopped the screen share for the time being because it looked like most folks were progressing through the Menti, and it, you know, from the discussion here, it sounds like there's a lot of things that we need to revisit and reconsider on how to structure. And honestly, you know, I really wish this community group was always just meeting in person in large groups so we could have open discussions. That was kind of always the hope, but then we fell into the trap of trying to do engagement activities. So really appreciate everyone's openness and willingness to ask the hard questions, poke and prod on the challenges, and then collectively find paths forward. Just trying to see if I missed anything in the chat before moving on. But generally, this was the agenda item, right? Activity and discussion on recommendations for adaptation actions. There's really great feedback for us as the project team. Don't want to cut short the discussion because we got plenty of time for the next one too. Daniel had a question in the sea level rise coastal erosion one. One of the questions was elevate communities. That generally is sort of in the pantheon of sea level rise adaptation approaches. One where you stay in place and you just start over time raising and building up the ground level. This is being done in some places right now. Kapalama Terminal at the harbor, it's been elevating its surface as they're redeveloping. Sand Island Wastewater Treatment Plant is elevating the ground level for the secondary digester, sort of in spot situations all around the Ala Moana and Kaka'ako TOD area. They're elevating either potentially as a result of sea level rise information, but primarily to meet today's FEMA flood insurance rate maps. That's where you've gotten some of the elevation change, whether it's on the KS side or the Ward Village side. But it's all well and good to do one particular property, but there's obviously a whole series of things that a parcel depends upon in terms of the infrastructures that support, whether it's wastewater, drinking water, telecom, or even drainage and road connections. And the best example, at least for showing the physical ability to elevate, not necessarily the best strategy or idea, is the city of Miami Beach, and they are primarily doing it through a $400 million bond plus increases in their stormwater fee, all of which are going towards elevating roadways and then supporting the properties to ultimately come up to the same grade. So the community itself put its money where its mouth is and then went whole hog doing the work, there was some pushback. They had some additional support from ULI to revisit the urban design and economic consequences, but they're plugging ahead, recognizing the realities that they have. Daniel, did you want to share your question here regarding the Kuleana, who's doing what, price benefit, et cetera?
Yeah. What I wanted to know is, in one of the future sessions or community sessions, is there, or ourselves in the planning sessions, start to identify who's going to be responsible for carrying out some of these actions. And I think the community would like to know that, and that could be a way of helping to determine priorities. Because if we say the city's responsible for it, but they currently don't do it, that means that's additional tax revenue somewhere. It has to be taken from additional tax revenue, or taking away services that exist currently to do these services. So, that's some trade-off people could understand. The other would be, some of the tree planting is maybe just for nonprofits or will take community effort. I'm sure somewhere along in this planning process, we'll start to identify whose kuleana is each of these activities. But I think people would like to know ahead of time, or where in the process that would happen.
Yeah, and I think, yes, so you're right in the staging. It is part of the next discussion, because it needs to be, because that's when all the things are being, final drafts are being put forth, and the sort of the specifics of any of these things are being identified. There's depending on how far along conversations are able to be had, there's always the challenge of identifying community when it hasn't really been articulated, yeah, the who and the how and the when, and we wouldn't want to be presumptive that it's like a handing off of city responsibility. So oftentimes there's a primary focus of like, what is the city's jurisdiction and responsibility? So oftentimes those are the things that are presented at least as primary, but that's a great acknowledgement, both yours and Shar's comments, that there's a lot of other ways to get good work done. So how do we start to queue up those conversations as early as possible? So if you got ideas, lay it on us.
I have another question that I wanted to just put out there, and it's the elephant in the room. We've been in the middle of a pandemic. We are looking at huge impacts to our budgets, right? What's going to be available. So there's going to be a lot of either reallocating, cuts happening. What is the strategy for us to also look at these? We're talking about, if we had none of this COVID-19 impacts happen, right? We would have been facing just the normal, how are we going to pay for all these things? We're having cost conversations already. So now with this additional challenges, right? Our community members, our workers, our businesses, our nonprofits are facing some hardships. So even the conversations with our community groups on partnerships, looking at how do we help to cost share, right? That, yes, is going to have to happen. But where we are right now, are we also considering that there is going to have to be additional planning that goes into how do we develop these resources to pay for these at this stage we're at right now? So I just wanted to put that out to the group, that this planning sessions of WE is an excellent, excellent step. Now we have an additional consideration and concern. So think about that too along the way as we go through all of these.
Yeah, and part of the project scope acknowledged this from the beginning, that we weren't immediately going to have all the answers and ideas and paths forward. And the next activity, as well as more work that's being done with departments, with the project consultants, are to work towards these sort of like decision-making alignment tools, whether it's equity screen, budget screens, so that we are being as open and transparent about how decisions are being made with the finite and precious resources that are going to take a hit this coming year. Maybe there'll be some additional support from the federal administration in the near term, who knows in the long term. but we need to be in a position with projects in mind so that we can be competitive and show and prove that we can do partnerships and that we can turn money into physical things. And that's, it relates to this project and this agenda item. That's a key focus for the new administration, is to show and entrust to the federal government that we are also good partners at the local level. And it requires having the community conversations to say, yes, we will agree that once this project and appropriations come, that we will have a project at the end. And that only comes with trust and having the decision-making support, both through a climate resilience and equity screen, and having these things to make sure that we are being wise with the money and the budget decisions. It's iterative at this point. That's what we're striving towards in terms of really strong recommendations through this process and the other things that we're learning through the other equity work that's going on in the city. I know that doesn't answer it totally sharp, but that's really what we're all collectively striving towards. Kieran had a question.
Yes. So kind of pairing on to that, at what point, or has the engagement with our congressional delegation already taken place through this process, during this process, and not after it? Because I would think that would be a key piece to be speaking with our CODELs as we're going through this process, and not at the end when we have the data, because they're ultimately going to be some of those key point people or pieces of this puzzle to, as you said, chase after some of those funding in the near term in this new administration. And I would think that their input through this community engagement process would be good. So has that been taken into consideration?
Yeah, we have ongoing relationships, obviously, with the two senators' offices. We have growing relationships now with Rep. Kahele. We've participated in a couple of their briefings last week, and then there's another one this week, Friday, so that we can better understand how to work with them, how they can work with us, how to understand the appropriations that just came through. But again, the primary thing is also to be prepared when there's asks, because they are there to support us. And unless there's been at least some vetting or some consensus working about, yes, we have things that needs and opportunities, please help us. The intention is not solely to rely upon federal leadership and federal support, but that's something that we cannot squander moving forward.
And to your point, showing those cards during the process, at least the directive of what funds they're looking at and what may be available, and they see the direction of the priorities in the process instead of coming to point B and having to go backwards again. That's, I guess, my question of the engagement part. So,
and I would say, maybe it's related to climate action, climate adaptation, economic recovery, economic development, prosperity into the future. We're fortunate that there's been great leadership for the last 4 years. We're even more fortunate that a lot of that legwork has been done, so that we are positioned with renewed and incoming federal leadership that really understands the long-term trajectory and arc, but also the opportunity to connect things that both address climate and also improve upon community and economic prosperity. So I think we're setting the stage for that, and these kinds of advisory groups are critical to being prepared for that. I'll take another catch my breath to see if there's final comments or questions on this activity. Again, we have a lot of homework to do on our end as the project team, really great input on the way things were presented, opportunities to improve it, but also appreciate the reinforcing that we obviously just need to both invite, and then if they're unable to participate, find ways to communicate with more and diverse groups and sectors. So unless there's no objection or subsequent discussion, I'd like to advance us to the next agenda item. Okay, seeing none. And Chip, thanks for that final concluding remark. Okay, so again, we have another activity and discussion. This is primarily going to be really brief background and summary presentation from myself and Ujay based on content from round 1, and really furthers that discussion that we just had at the end of the last agenda item, thinking through these frameworks, these things that help people understand the how and the why of decisions, and hopefully helps to build confidence in, but also trust in ability to do partnerships, ability to be open and honest about why things are being discussed, what are the trade-offs in all of these things moving forward. So I'm going to ask, you guys have heard a lot from me. I'm going to hand it over to Ujay, one of our team members here, to talk us through this next bit.
Great. Thank you, Matt. So for this next activity here, we'll be talking about one of the other activities we'll be developing and one of the other tools, the Climate Resilience and Equity Screen. And we'll be utilizing this to evaluate each action and make sure we're achieving, the maximum equitable outcome for each specific action. So before we do that and before we start exploring the screen, I thought we'd, I think it's important to reflect on the work that we've already done, all of us together as the advisory HUI and as well as with community as well. And so in round 1, during the engagement workshops, one of the questions we asked is, what should be the guiding values or principles for climate adaptation? And we developed these values word clouds, and you can see them both here, one for advisory HUI and one for the community workshop, And terms and ideas like community, Pono, equity, and equity-based featured prominently in guiding principles and values. And equity emerged as an important guiding principle. This informed our decision to develop a climate resilience and equity screen. How do we pursue equity and how do we institutionalize equity in the process so that we're actually instituting adaptation actions that, have equitable outcomes. Next slide, please. So bringing forward certain intro survey questions, looking at the guiding principles question, but also we asked a specific question, a series of 2 questions. Do you think different types of communities are affected differently by climate change? And, what, if any, concerns do you have that climate change impacts will affect individual communities unequally? And so you can see here, we received multiple responses. We looked at the intro survey, and we also received, responses from round 1, the engagement workshops. And these were the emerging concerns, especially with regard to frontline communities. Responses, range across a variety of different topics, from economic stability to culture to health to disaster preparedness to access to key and critical services. And, even thinking about, the context we're in right now with the impacts of the pandemic and the impacts of COVID-19, you can see here that that one of the concerns was unequal impacts of COVID-19. And so it's important for us to, take all of these concerns and, see how we can tie them into climate adaptation and each of the adaptation actions. And so here, it's important, this is a continually iterative process, as we go through these rounds, we're in round 3 now, we'll be going through round 4 and round 5 as well later. And we welcome input throughout. So I wanted to pause for a couple minutes here to give you all an opportunity to react to the answers listed here. A lot of this was taken from your responses in round 1. So if anybody recognizes an answer that they submitted during the activity and would like to elaborate on, I'd like to give them an opportunity to do so here. Or even if there's, a certain key concern, this is a comprehensive list, but if anybody would like to add a key concern that they don't see mentioned, I wanted to open the space and welcome people to add that here as well.
Yeah, thank you, Jay. And again, as people are thinking through this, right, so these same questions were conducted with you all in round 1, as well as lived online on a survey, and were part of the community meetings in round 1. So you're seeing really a sort of a grouping and a distillation of well over 300 responses through that process. And as we move forward, the intention and hope, consistent with what we were discussing with Shar and both budget and people considerations in all of our decisions moving forward, the intention is to work towards a screen to help us think through implementation of the project ideas. A lot of the thoughts, though perhaps not structured within an existing equity frame, have already come to bear through your participation, the discussions that we had on the mapping activity last meeting, as well as these initial thoughts from the intro meeting.
One thing, this is Kathy, one thing I don't see on this list is the increase of housing, the cost of housing. Because as we're building up, or as we're building around TOD and looking at these density issues to help provide supply to reduce the cost of housing, by having impacts of sea level rise, it impacts your costs, which impacts the cost of the housing. So I think that's one of those not unintended consequences, but one of those consequences that isn't upfront and easy to kind of think of, like unable to afford access because roadway erosion or things like that. But actually the cost of housing can be significantly impacted as well. So.
Yeah, Kathy, maybe a question for you, because cost can be on two sides, right? The actual construction cost, but then it's the cost for a resident.
That's
and
what I was thinking, yeah.
Maybe it's important to parse them out, actually, because, you know, maybe the occupant discussion is better presented as like, I'm getting it mixed up right now, but basically like housing plus transportation. So making sure that the cost of living is a fuller discussion, and on balance, thinking through potential savings on one, even if another is going up, while we don't want cost to go up really at all, because that's a challenge. If we only narrow in on one indicator or one variable, we might lose opportunity to think of broader discussions, especially in a TOD area. If that's okay, right. Maybe as we're taking our notes, if we can, if you're okay with that, think on
yeah, no, absolutely. But maybe I'm thinking of it more simplistically as maybe operational costs of once you're in your place living there, and the cost that will be the impacts to you. But also, if the cost of construction is higher, which it will be when you're looking at vertical, then your cost of delivering that product could also be impacted if you're having to, let's say, instead of having 20 floors of housing, you only have 19 because you're accounting for the bottom level of being sea level rise. So now those 19 floors, the cost of building the 20 floors is spread across the 19 floors. So when the home buyer is looking to buy it, he's actually having to pay more.
So sorry, but this is Dave Arakawa. A classic, I agree with Kathy that the impact on affordable housing or housing is not necessarily in here, and it all boils down to cost benefit analysis. So there'd be two things that should be in the slide. One is a cost benefit analysis and the impact of different communities, and the other is the impact on housing. I'll give you an example. Bill 25, I'll try to be quick. They costed out the requirements in the original Bill 25. It would have meant $25,000, $24,000 and change additional cost to a single unit. $24,000 and change additional cost to a single unit. And that cost, to Charlotte's question, the developer is not going to eat that cost. The developer is going to put that cost on the home buyer, okay? And it'll either increase the cost of that home, or they'll use lesser materials and more cheaper materials in that home, or they won't develop in communities like Oʻahu, right, where I grew up, right? They'll just say, you know what, people cannot afford this here. We're just not going to develop in Oʻahu, right? So those are the impacts. And things like, and sometimes we need to do the cost benefit analysis, because original version of Bill 25 would have required EV ready charging, 25% EV ready charging, and those EV ready chargers would have gone in enclosed garages. So how many people where I grew up would live in an enclosed, have an enclosed garage. That's not for everybody, right? So we changed the bill to incentivize developers to actually build EV charging stations, rapid charging stations in public areas where everybody, all members of the public could benefit, like parks, shopping centers, community centers, things like that, instead of inside of an enclosed garage. So you see.
So David, specifically, what's the recommendation for us to make sure we don't lose tier?
The recommendation would be on this list of statements. Do you think different types of communities are affected differently by climate change? Yes, because some can do the improvements, some cannot, and the concerns of the impacts that are unequal would be the city has usually chosen to do one size fits all. So if the millionaires up on Wailaiki Ridge can afford it, they impose that on every community, no matter how rich or how poor, and tough luck, right? You know, so that's the thing that should be in there. That there should be a
okay. So contextual approaches. If,
and cost benefit
again,
analysis.
if we're alluding to actual regulations, but that sounds like what I'm trying to get at what your specifics are. I know you're using the examples, but want to make sure that we get your sentiment so that others can also chime in.
Okay, so we need to be careful. My sentiment is, you know, when we answer those survey questions, those survey questions get turned into laws, which get turned into mandates, which apply to affordable housing as well as for sale housing and everything else, right? And sometimes those mandates are going to increase. In Bill 1, in Bill 25, City and County Bill 25, it increased the cost of a house by a unit by 24 grand. So we need to be careful when we answer these types of questions or surveys. We don't know what the cost benefit is going to be. That's all. I'm sorry.
No, it's good conversation, because you know, we also want to make sure that people feel that they deserve benefits, and we don't want to hide potential benefits without the real cost implications. But again, we got to find ways to address all this stuff, whether it's incentivized, federal funds, regulations, somehow figuring out new schemes for funding, generating revenue or whatever, because if it always comes back to that's not going to work, then we're stuck, and we're telling people they're not supported into the future, and that's not going to work either. So I really appreciate the balance and the continued discussions around all this. Chip had his hand up.
Yeah, thank you. So one of the communities that we tend to ignore is outside of Hawaii, is the developing nations of the world, where our high consumption lifestyle exports the environmental damage to supply us with our mineral resources, our timber, our beef. And nations largely at the equator or in the Southern Hemisphere are the ones that are economically strapped and are selling off their resources at extremely unsustainable rates in order that we may live, you know, high-flying lifestyles. And this is a community that represents, that takes the direct hit of climate change strongest and the biodiversity crisis strongest. So I think it's important ethically for us to think beyond the shores of just Hawaii, and to realize that we are high consumers, and that other communities elsewhere in the world are paying the cost in the form of environmental damage for that.
No, so Chip, again, for this, maybe what that means for us to consider is not just like an internal discussion of equity and unequal and disparate impacts, but also to have a reminder over the horizon, literally, to other places. And I don't know how to frame that as a question yet, but that, you know, I hear you, and we'll make sure that we have it in the notes to consider in the proposals for an equity screen moving forward. You know, it's part like multi-generational, but also thinking across geographies too.
just thinking global equity, global social equity.
Okay. And this is great. This really, we have a couple of more sort of background example type slides just to provide you and empower you with additional information on things that have transpired the last several months. But this really is how this agenda item was intended to go, to have a lot of back and forth conversation. So thank you all for just jumping straight into it. Keep this in mind. I want to move us along. I did just do a quick time check. This is really great conversation. We'll have opportunities to just share this all again, but I want to maybe just go through quickly the next couple of slides, which again provide more of the background information that has influenced how we even got to this initial question and where we hope to go based on your guidance and recommendation. So I'm going to ask Ujay to help walk us through this additional information.
Yeah, thank you. A lot of great conversation there and a lot of great, suggestions for, added concerns. Here, again, thinking about, the groundwork that the city has worked on, right, and in conjunction with community to advance climate equity at the policy level. Ordinance 20-47, which is related to the duties and responsibilities of the Resilience Office, passed in, it was Bill 65, passed in December. And a core component of that is, the office shall establish and manage a climate resilience and equity program. Now, what does that mean, right? It's defined there, the various responsibilities of the office. And what that means is now written into law to ensure that, we are advancing the equity program and critical equity policy. Resolution 20-41, is the Honolulu City Council's commitment to equity. Basically, proclaiming the Honolulu City Council's commitment to equity and social justice and to the realization of equitable outcomes for frontline communities. And there's, a definition of, what equity means, especially in the context here in Hawaii. And I'm going to ask our colleague Isabella to submit a list in chat, the definition of what frontline communities actually mean. Frontline communities are essentially the groups that are both first and most impacted by a crisis, and also less able to recover from a crisis. And so, there are specific communities that are listed under frontline communities, low-income communities, indigenous communities, and the list is there. You can look at it more in depth. This is directly taken from the equity resolution. And I'll also ask Isabella to include the links to the two policies as well, Ordinance 20-47 and Resolution 20-41, so you can review them more, on your own time. Thank you. Okay, so, working towards a climate resilience and equity screen. And here we basically, what is a climate resilience and equity screen? It's a series of carefully crafted questions to ask, of each adaptation action that's developed. The purpose of the screen is to, ensure, equitable outcomes. We want each adaptation action to, pursue as much of an equitable outcome as it can. And, to, first, identify potential burdens to vulnerable groups. Second, tease out opportunities to reduce and eliminate those burdens to, vulnerable groups. And then third, find opportunities to improve quality of life for those vulnerable groups. So, with these questions, we hope to, really interrogate each of these adaptation actions and challenge them to really do the most that they can towards equity. The why. So, this series of questions is important. It institutionalizes equity in the planning and implementation process. Without a screen such as this, without a series of questions like this, these impacts and opportunities may not be naturally considered in the process. So institutionalizing it so that whoever is in charge of implementation is asking the right question. When is it used? It will be used at a stage prior to action implementation to ensure actions are implemented with impacts to frontline communities considered in the process. So, we're developing it now, and then prior to implementation of each action, we'll ask these critical questions. And then also thinking about the timeline of its development. So here, we're introducing the concept of a screen. I'll share a couple of examples with you shortly from a couple of other cities. In round 4, we will finalize the screen with community and solicit your input again to improve the screen's questions. And in between round 3 and 4, based on your input here, we'll workshop with our team. We have a climate and resilience equity program in the office. We'll workshop with their team, and based on your input, we'll come with a proposal to you come round 4. And this graphic here, it just outlines, all of the things that have come together, from the Climate Ready Oahu analysis, work done at the city level, and other city examples, that ultimately led to this decision, taking all of these sources into account when developing the screen. Next slide, please. Thank you. So focusing in on equity, it's important to recognize the work we're building on always. We're building on work from round 1. We're building on, the intro survey, and we're also building on, we've just released the draft climate action plan for review, just recently in this past month. It includes a framework of evaluation for greenhouse gas reduction strategies. The series of questions here, and you can read them on the screen. The series of questions is similar to the screen where we're working towards, but operates at a broader level. So it touches on issues such as city jurisdiction, opportunities for co-benefits. These are issues that we'll also be looking at for adaptation actions. But for this, tool in particular, the climate resilience and equity screen, our goal is to take the specific question, is it equitable, and break it down further, and ask a series of questions that really opens up this this really key component of climate adaptation and climate mitigation. This next slide here. So now going into other city examples. So Portland, is one example we're looking at, and just talk about the uniqueness of the Portland example. It's one list. It has 7 total questions. There are no additional requirements for question responses beyond just answering the question. You answer the question, and then, depending on how it satisfies, the response satisfies, what you're looking for. And these 7 questions cover 7 key concerns. So number 1 here, you can see it covers a desired result of the action. Number 2 looks at current and historical racial disparities. Number 3 looks at land and space affected and people's connection to the land and space. Number 4 looks at the primary beneficiaries of the specific action. Number 5 and 6 look at frontline communities. Number 5 looks at the positive impacts. Number 6 looks at the negative impacts. And number 7 looks at community partnerships. And so this is one example from Portland. Next slide, please. San Antonio. So this is the second example we're looking at. And you can see it's different, very different from Portland's example. It looks at 5 lists under 5 themes and 48 questions under each theme. And there are 34 total questions. So compared to Portland's 7 questions, it's a lot more, it's a lot different. Doesn't mean it's more comprehensive. They're both, I think, comprehensive in their own way. And this question requires, if you look at the table, at first it requires a yes or no response to acknowledge the potential for opportunity. The second column looks at addressing the action's ability to positively/negatively benefit the theme. And the third column looks at, outlining recommendations for implementation. So basically acknowledging, is there an opportunity here? And then the third column really then if the answer is yes, there is an opportunity, then really outlining the recommendations for the person who's then in charge for implementation. Yeah, and so these are the 2, looking at them side by side. I'm going to ask Haley to open up a poll here. Basically, asking, after, and I know there was a lot of information, basically laying down the groundwork for what we're working towards, just to introduce the concept. But I wanted to gauge from you all, which format do you prefer to serve as a model for a climate resilience and equity screen? And you can look here, in this comparative table, the 2 examples side by side, to then better inform, what you prefer as a tool to, work towards equitable outcomes.
And while you're all doing that, I'll level with you. When we were looking at these examples, we didn't find the evidence base that showed how they were being used, examples from the municipalities, assurances that this is how information is being considered and processed towards decision making. We have some additional open-ended questions which will really round out the discussion for this agenda item. I imagine some people's reactions are even like, well, do you need this? Isn't this just part and parcel of doing good governance or good community engagement or good projects, plans, programs, et cetera? Sure, yes, maybe if everyone is doing all that, but I think, you know, there's evidence that would counter that assertion. So the intention is to try to develop this kind of more formalized and open process, and then think about the who, how, where, when it's utilized, how is that information shared out. We don't yet have a beat on the intentions on like citywide application and use of tools like this, whether it's DTS or DPP or even budget and fiscal, thinking about our capital and operating funds. Again, this is real nascent stuff, and we're thankful for your participation through this iterative process. And we hope that this project and then subsequent activities carried out by the city will just continue to further the realization and the benefit of these gut questions and having these open discussions. So as that poll continues, just to get you towards more of the open-ended discussion that we're hoping to get from you all. Pretty unstructured here. We had some leading questions. We're basically just looking for your thoughts, any points of clarity that you need from us, and then recommendations on sort of the promises and pitfalls of trying to establish another screen to support decision-making alignment. I think one of the other great benefits is like you have a tool like this and it's out there and community has it in hand and also can use that to fire questions back to government agencies, partners, et cetera. And David had a question of, do we have to choose between either Portland or San Antonio? This is Hawaii, exclamation point. The main point was like, one of these examples shows a truncated list. Another example shows a broader category, a broader suite of questions across themes and categories. So it's less about adopting Portland's or adopting San Antonio's and more about thinking through really just a lot of questions, simpler questions, fewer questions. What's the reality of who's going to use this? And that's what this open discussion is now at this point in time. So what I again,
hand raised by, oh, sorry. I saw someone's hand raised.
Adam, hi.
Hey, how's it going? Yeah, I think for me, you know, all of this is important and helpful, but what's really critical, you know, working with a nonprofit that has a project together with the city out at Sunset Beach, is the political will to actually execute. These are all wonderful things to talk about, and I see where David's coming from. Obviously, he has a very specific perspective as it relates to actual, you know, how policy then evolves. And of course, that's part and parcel what this is all about. But I think what's going to be important as we engage the community and we try to get to a place that then actually works for nonprofits, organizations, communities, and the people and entities we're talking about, is that there's an actual political will to execute. So for us, you know, we've partnered at Sunset Beach with the city to do a dune restoration project, which is, you know, exactly, you know, it is purpose built to address some of the issues that we're talking about today. And yet there hasn't been to date a meaningful amount, other than saying that we have a partnership, in my opinion, of political will to actually support the work that we in the community are doing. So I guess what I'm trying to share is, I think all of what we're going through is super valuable, and you and your team are doing a great job. But somehow we need to connect the dots as we go through the process, that there is going to be, whether it's that we go through your office, Matt, or you know, whatever the proper approach would be, to actually help execute on the back end, whatever these different plans are. Because I mean, with all due respect to what David's saying, there can be an equal argument made that, you know, someone in the community could say, oh no, at some point, the laws of supply and demand are going to regulate what a house can cost and how much is a developer making on a home, et cetera. So I agree with David, there has to be an exchange of these ideas. And then on the back end, though, there has to be a political will, whether that's and I think what David's pointing out, whether that manifests itself as policy, you know, or whether it's part and parcel of just political will that is an ability to work together with Department of Parks or different things where there's synergies that can be created. Because I would say, especially in these kind of difficult times that I think Sherry mentioned earlier about the challenges financially, working creatively and cooperatively with the community and other nonprofit groups and entities that have an interest, who also will be facing very real fiscal challenges. We as a small organization certainly are. But there could be synergies to, you know, like save costs and achieve more, you know. But I think that we somehow have to create that bridge to go along with the great structure that you guys are working on as well. But I just wanted to raise that because I worry that we go through this process and then even people that participated don't really know how to access and follow through with what the execution level is.
Sure. No, thanks for that. And you know, a couple of thoughts and reactions. Obviously, the North Shore Sustainable Communities Plan is starting its update process. We want to make sure that we have as much support to that process through discussions that we're having now, especially on thinking through implementation, decision-making alignment. A lot of what you alluded to, for me, really gets to that, like, other screens to consider for decision-making. You know, we know equity is an important component. We know it's not the only component in how decisions are made. Even reacting to, I missed a couple of comments from Chip and others that echoed, like, what is our preference? And not just thinking about us, the team members or the office preference, but thinking about how we coordinate and support agencies to use it. I don't see most agencies, staff or directors or leadership getting on board with something that's so expensive, say as the San Antonio example, maybe, but you know, the things that make it look like more work potentially cause hesitation and utilizing it. So if there are ways to you know, I'm a bit of a lumper myself. I like to bring things together, and if there's ways to present the best questions with the most impact to still get towards the goals and the aspirations, that might be a strategy. You know, I'm answering out loud my own questions about used by who and when, you know, the types of screen, how do we know it's being used? These are all just questions that we're trying to have with other agencies right now. And a lot of new leadership getting accustomed to thinking about all of the challenges around the island, but also all of the great community input and leadership that we should be tapping into to help us make decisions. I kind of danced around a lot of there, but again, this isn't for us to tell you stuff, it's for us to get info from you. Yeah, thanks for that, Pauline. Tedious and maybe intimidating as well. I mean, also, like, we're open to, you know, we know there's a great diversity of representation and organizations here, as well as community members on the call. I don't know how you all go about making decisions in your agencies. I don't know if these are things, you know, when I was writing up one of these of like examples of screens, I'm not sure if Jessica from Hi-Fi has practice in this, but you know, there was a push at one point in time to not just require environmental impact analysis, but also to require health impact analysis and assessments for projects. And that's certainly a tool and a screen that exists. It didn't become required. It didn't pick up a lot of steam, but you know, a lot of these same kinds of questions get at existing processes for evaluating proposals. And what we're trying to do is maybe add to the way decisions are made or how things are considered. And maybe since I put her on the spot, she put her camera on, so I wasn't sure if there's anything you wanted to add, Jessica.
Thanks, Matthew. Yeah, I mean, this is such a new area of work for us, so I haven't chimed in a lot. But to your point, yes, in the past, there had been consideration about looking at everything through a public health lens. At our organization, we've been doing a lot of work over the last year, I'd say, really looking at equity and looking through everything with an equity lens and making sure that policies we're working on, are being viewed through that lens and are pushing forward initiatives that are going to help everybody, but really helping and impacting our communities. But happy, I could talk with you offline a bit about some of the work that we've been doing. It's hard to figure out the best way to put some of these things into practice, into everyday work. And that's where we're at now, really kind of looking through and figuring out how we put it all into practice.
Yeah, it's one thing to sort of promote and educate, but once you work towards processes, how do you socialize them, make them required? Like again, it's all iterative, and that's what we're hoping to advance here as well.
Mm-hmm.
And I know, this is rather unstructured conversation. We're also at the tail end of a long meeting, so very much open. There's really no other agenda items except open discussion and talking about next meeting. So don't want to cut it short in case anyone has more reactions for us to consider. The intention is based on our conversation here, conversations with departments, the community meetings, is to have this also be an important part of round 4 discussions so that we can finalize proposals and recommendations on the last phase, which is, coming to completion on the project, of which decision-making alignment has been one of the strong intentions.
Hey, Matt, it's Dan, and just wanted to share that I'm glad you guys are looking at equity. I mean, not an issue that I'd really given much thought to until more recently when you look at the pandemic and you look at uneven impacts and just you can focus on one area like education and access to resources and so forth. So I really think it's really worth doing. And just one thought going back a little bit in the conversations on benefits, sometimes the benefit is something else. And so it's really hard to look at a narrow sliver of an action, that there's ancillary benefits and there's also a collective benefit. And how to capture all of that just makes for a more complex equation. And it's just something that I think shouldn't get lost. And you said something a little while ago that was really, doing nothing is really not an option. So if you start with that's a helpful place. And then these actions, don't look at them as discrete. They really need to be looked at as a whole system of actions. And certain things will have other benefits elsewhere that may or may not be captured. And equity is a really good example of that. If you leave a group behind, you'll end up having greater costs somewhere else down the line as you look at the whole equation. And I love Chip Fletcher's, I had to Google, I'd never heard of the wicked problem before. And there's, I found out it's from 1967. So, it is the wicked problem, sea level rise. So thank you for educating me and helping me look a little bit more broadly.
Great, thanks, Dan. Maybe before we move on to the next agenda item, real quickly, just we've gotten good conversation, some related to this project, some not, in the chat, and want to acknowledge that there are other participants who are not advisory WHOI members. So any quick comments on this agenda item from non-advisory WHOI members? Okay, I'm going to leave this on, no need to share screen at this point moving forward. The next agenda item is public input for matters not on the agenda. And don't feel obligated to share just to share. Don't want to discourage sharing, but acknowledging the time check. Hearing none. The next agenda item is discussion about next tentative meeting date. I don't have a proposal for you right now. We're working with the project team to make sure that we align a next advisory WHOI member meeting at the appropriate time in the workflow. It looks like potentially the last week in March or the first week in April. I'll make sure to get that information as soon as possible so that we can request that you hold a meeting date. In the past, we've held them on Mondays. We just did a Tuesday this week because of the holiday yesterday. And again, based on past preferences, probably looking again at a 3:30 p.m. start. Any questions or concerns on the last week in March? Looks like the 29th or April the 5th. Probably too hard to tell. High-powered people, you probably don't even know what you're doing tomorrow. Okay, so with all that, this has been honestly like my favorite advisory WHOI meeting to date. I think just because, everyone's really been thinking through, coming up to the same comprehension level on the realities of the challenges, thinking through the needs, but also the opportunities, right? It's not just about preparing for the worst, but thinking about opportunities to positively affect community and environmental change through time to ensure that we have continued prosperity into the future. And that's really what climate change is. It's not just an environmental discussion. It's about human health, safety, and prosperity. Daniel, it looks like you have, Daniel Naho'opi'i has a question before I propose adjournment.
Just a quick one. I've had some community members ask me what's going to be covered in the next community meeting, the round 3 community meeting. They kind of want to know better. Yeah, next week's meetings, set of meetings.
Yeah, so refining some of the interactivity today, but the two main things that we're trying to engage upon are still the adaptation action idea generation and reactions, as well as further this equity discussion, where we are refining that interactivity because we know we took a lot of time. So it's certainly going to be a challenge to make it clear and accessible and approachable to share out, but also get valuable input. So TBD on the final machinations on the interactivity, but that's the intention, to look at adaptation actions and continue the equity screen discussion.
Okay, same like today. Okay.
Yeah. And really, that's again the benefit of having you all as our gut check, and the recommendations and support is to refine how we think about decision-making points along the project. Any other questions?
Hey, Matthew,
Go ahead, David.
Just want to thank you for keeping the discussion going and keeping the free flow of ideas, and keeping everybody open and participating. So thank you very much for your leadership.
Sure, thank you, David. I think we all acknowledge that the discussion should be 6 hours for one thing, not 2 hours for 20 things, but we appreciate everyone's time and participation. There's no shortage of of needs and community conversations or projects that are going on. It's difficult to participate in all of it and know about everything. So we appreciate you helping to drive the notices and promotion. Feel free to do direct emails, like to connect me with people on this project or other office activities. And we'll try to do our level best to start doing that outreach as well. The last item is that this meeting is now officially adjourned. Thanks, everybody. We'll make sure to share out the notes as soon as they're available, as well as the meeting content. Thank you.
Thank you.
folks.
Aloha, Matt. Aloha, everyone.
Aloha.
Aloha.
Aloha.